Okay, so when we last talked, we were talking about proteins, and what we need to know is that each R group from a protein is different for each amino acid. If you notice here, you've got glycine, alanine, glutamic acid, and histidine. Notice what's in the green is the R groups. And so notice each of those is different, and that's what actually makes those uh, have their specific name differences. All right, so glycine has an H, alanine has CH3. If you also notice, the blues are all the same and the reds are all the same. Those are amino groups and carboxyl groups. And then you have a hydrogen stuck in the middle here in purple. But the only thing that's different about any of these are the green tails, if you will. The groups here, the R groups, are what's different. There's about 20 different amino acids that we use to make proteins, and proteins are used essentially to make muscles. And what kind of chemical reaction do you think is used to join amino acids together? Well, that would be the dehydration synthesis. We've talked about that. And essentially, we're removing water, wringing the water out so that we can attach all of these without water being in the way. And when we do that, we get these long chains then of subunits that make proteins. The sequence of amino acids in the protein chain is actually determined by something I hope you've heard of before, the DNA code, deoxyribonucleic acid. We'll talk about that later in this PowerPoint. But for right now, you just need to know that the sequence of amino acids is determined by the DNA code. Proteins have a 3D shape. They likes want to be near the likes, okay? And so the hydrophobics and hydrophilics mixed with the R groups are what makes it fold over on top of itself. And so you have an illustration here of what an actual protein looks like. Now, hydrophobic, let's break that word apart. Phobic refers to phobia, which means fear. Hydro refers to water. So they are afraid of water or water fearing. And then you have the opposite of that, the inverse of that is hydrophilic. When philic means love, right? So hydro is water again. So they are water loving. So the water hating groups want to be on one end. The water loving groups want to be on the other end. And then you have R groups that kind of float in the middle to separate the two. But this is what actually makes it fold over on top of itself, is the placement of the hydrophobic, hydrophilic, and the R groups. They are actually held together by van der Waal forces and hydrogen bonds. Now, I don't expect you to go to great detail about those yet. It's coming, but we'll go in a lot more detail about hydrogen bonds when you get into Chemistry 1 with me as juniors. Again, just a reminder at this point, if you have questions, please post those on today's meet. You can go and post any questions, and I'll come by and answer those for you. So what do proteins do? But before we get there, let's look at where proteins are actually found. Notice you see them in beans and nuts. You see them in fish and seafood, poultry, chicken, meat, any sort of meat product, and also dairy product like your eggs there, bacon, pork. All of those things are where you're going to obtain your proteins. Notice that none of these really have any sugar added at all, right? There's no carbs, there's no saccharides, no polysaccharides, there's none there. Everything is a meat product except for nuts and beans, right? And all of these are where you're very high in proteins. So if you need proteins in your diet, this is the place to go to get those. Just to revisit, we are talking about proteins, so we're going to kind of talk about the sugar tail here on the end, so the glycoprotein. Remember that they help the cells recognize themselves, right? So they say, oh, this is a part of my body. We should not attack it. It's not an invader, right? It's safe. It's normal. It's what should be happening. Also, the glycoproteins, remember, this is just revisiting that because we're talking about sugars and proteins together. Our blood types, organ rejection, and then recognizing germs, viruses, bacteria. All of those things occur because of glycoproteins. So proteins are structural, right? Structural, they help set up our structure. Proteins and phospholipids, which is a fat, we'll talk more about that. And as we go through this, you'll see how all of these things sort of join hand in hand to make our body work and function as it should. So they are main components in cell membranes, right? And so you've got a diagram here. Please take time to go ahead and illustrate this diagram in your notes. Don't just skip over diagrams. Go ahead and put these out because you're going to see them again, okay? You've got the protein molecules that you see here as the large molecules that are in the cell wall. And then you have lipid molecules, which are these. They have these little tails. And lipids are funny too. You'll learn about lipids coming up, but lipids also are hydrophobic or hydrophilic. And we'll talk about what that means and how lipids act and behave in that fashion as well. But for right now, know that they are structural, and then when you mix them with fats, you actually get a cell wall start to being built. So proteins will combine with DNA to wrap up into chromosomes. And so we've talked about chromosomes before. You will definitely talk about chromosomes a lot next year when you have biology with Miss Matthews. But chromosomes are highly important. You can have X chromosomes, Y chromosomes. That's what makes us male or female, and store our identity. But we'll talk more about that later. But you need to know that proteins are very important along with DNA here. Proteins can also act as enzymes, and enzymes basically help chemical reactions take place faster. They do this by lowering activation energy. Please write that down, even though it may not be on that slide. I went too far. Let me back up. They lower activation energy. Write that down, okay? Enzymes are very important. A lot of enzymes will always have the ending on them, OSE. Like lactose is an enzyme that helps us digest milk sugar, dairy products. You may have heard of people becoming lactose intolerant, where they can't have or stomach dairy products. So you want to make sure that you get that down as well. Proteins can also have the power to control genetics or control genes. And they do this by turning them on and off. And that is very critical. If genes are left in the on position, right, then they keep making certain products, whatever that gene is in control of. And actually, believe it or not, this is how cancer happens, right? Protein leaves a gene on, it doesn't get turned off. And so in doing that, you start the process of growing what's called a tumor, right? And that just means you get overstimulation, overproduction of a certain type of cell, and they keep multiplying and turning into an actual tumor. And so that is one of the main causes of cancer. So a lot of research is into how do we make these proteins turn the genes back off. If you want them turned on from time to time when you're injured, when you're sick, so that you get the normal production that you need, but then you want those to be turned back off so that you don't get tumor growth or cancer starting in your body. So this is a very important feature of proteins. Proteins help our body fight germs. You may have heard the term antibodies before. And germs, bacteria, viruses, all of those things invade our body. And the antibodies actually surround them, attack them, and kill them. So a lot of times when you're sick, you've got a cold, sore throat, you may go to the doctor. And if your body's not doing a good enough job of kicking those things out and killing those, he's going to prescribe for you, or she will prescribe for you, something called an antibiotic. And that just means it's a pill or a shot that they're going to give you that's going to give you a boost of antibodies so that it will actually kill the bacteria or the virus. So that's important also to note. We're going to go through a lot of malfunctions of these macromolecules later, probably Friday or Monday, and you'll get to see a whole series of diseases and viruses and bacteria that can attack your body and symptoms. We'll go through all of that because that's going to be important in your next feature when you become the doctor next week in your project. Proteins can help in transportation. They help move molecules in and out of cells. Remember we talked about the cell membrane. Well, the cell membrane is that part of the cell that basically allows things to filter in and out. And it acts much just like a filter. Filter has those pores. We talked about pore size. Filter has different size pores. Well, the same way here with the cell membrane. If something is too large, it cannot get through the cell membrane to come into the molecule, right? So proteins actually help in moving these things across that cellular membrane. So things can come in, things can come out, and be balanced. That's a very important feature. Something called homeostasis is another important term. We'll talk more about that again on your last lecture note, probably Friday, maybe Monday. We'll see how far we get this week. Proteins are very important in transporting something called hemoglobin. In red blood cells, hemoglobin actually carries oxygen to all of your body cells. So if you're low on hemoglobin, you're going to be low in oxygen supply. There are certain malfunctions of hemoglobin that we'll talk about as well. But for right now, know that hemoglobin carries oxygen, right? They exist in red blood cells and they're going to carry oxygen to all of your body. So hemoglobin is very important. Proteins can help with movement. Body muscles, flagella, and mitotic spindles are all made of proteins. So what you have here is you've got a guy with his muscle, right? You see that? We talked about how that's important in muscle development. Proteins help build muscle. The other thing that's maybe not as commonly known, and you've got a picture down here, is that they also are the flagella. Flagella just means basically it's a tail, right? You see this big long tail on this picture at the bottom right. And what that actually is a sperm cell. And so that sperm will actually use that tail as a way to move. And so without that tail, the sperm goes nowhere. So it's very essential in reproduction that the sperm have that tail so that it can wiggle that tail and move forward through the female to implant into the egg. And that would be the point at which pregnancy occurs. The other thing here are mitotic spindles. Mitotic spindles are fibers that attach to chromosomes, and they are also part of your cytoskeleton that help muscle attachment. So things like ligaments and tendons and all those things really need mitotic spindles to be there. And they're also existing in actual muscle structure. You might have heard the term striation or striated. That is comes from the muscle, and if we can look at some muscles later, animal muscles, so you can actually see the striations, and I'll try to get those in to a slide as well for you to look at. Proteins can act as hormones. Whether you believe it or not, insulin is a protein hormone, and it controls blood sugar. So if you eat food, any type of food, right, except for maybe the meats, breads, and everything that was a carb, right, is going to break down and become glucose in your bloodstream. So insulin actually takes and is a protein that is a hormone, goes into your bloodstream and actually lowers the amount of blood sugar. And so that is very important. If that doesn't correctly function, then you're going to become diabetic. And so that's, again, something we'll talk about under the symptoms and things that can go wrong with our body. Glucose again, right? Insulin causes cells to actually store the glucose. And so that's very important. If it doesn't get stored, it stays in your bloodstream and you get a really high sugar level. And